restoration is about accepting people where they are and walking with them through that.
That is what Jesus wants to invite you to be a part of. This is his church. And so we hope you'll come with us, that over this next year that you'll get involved, that those things that we just said will become true in your life, and that you get to be a part of us collectively seeing that happen in our community.
Everyone's different. We literally want to empower everyone, all people.
Well, good morning, everybody. How are we doing? Good. My name is Kurt, and I'm so glad that you're here today. Thanks for joining us. Not much fun to do outside in the rain, so glad you're here. But what's a phrase you say all the time? Righteous. I don't know if I believe you. What? Just, yeah, good. What else? Really? I don't know. This is fine. This is fine. I like it. Somewhere along the way, about a month or so ago, our 3-year-old Layton learned this phrase that he has said all the time, where he's like, "Silly me, my bad," and which is awesome at 3. He did not learn it from his mom or myself. So someone has taught him how to admit that he's wrong. So that's good. We're grateful for that. But we all have these phrases that we say. I had a boss that used to say, "Hold please," all the time. Just hold please. And not because he was busy, just if he was doing something for you. And so we actually made him a shirt that said, "Hold please," at one point. And we have these phrases that we just say over and over again, become kind of this thing that we're known for, perhaps, if you say it long enough. Elsa is known for saying, "Let it go." Buzz Lightyear's catchphrase is, "To infinity and beyond." There's all these different phrases. You're like, I know what's going on. You have Disney Plus. And so, yes. And so we have these characters in our life and stories that we love to connect with, that they have catchphrases, and they really become defining marks of that character or that person, and it can begin to represent a lot of who they are and how they see the world, how they engage with people. I had a mentor and a friend that said, if you take the top 3 things that you're known for saying for other people, and you put them on a card, and that, you read that card, that's how people view you. And so if the top 3 things that people most regularly hear you say is "come on," or "that's not good enough," or "try harder," whatever it might be, like, that's a big reflection on who you are as a parent, as a boss, as a friend. If people say, "Man, you always say great job," or "well done," or "I love that," or phrases that people hear from you a lot, that kind of creates this idea of really who you are. And so today we're going to talk about this idea as we continue this series called Brand New, of what is the thing that Jesus is most known for. What is the thing that Jesus was most known for saying? And Jesus, regardless of religious affiliation, people that don't believe he's the Son of God, people that don't even like organized religion, respect Jesus as a historical figure, as a teacher, for saying some important and profound things. Maybe that's how you kind of see Jesus right now, even as you're kind of exploring what it looks like to be a part of a community that follows Jesus. You're looking at, what did he say? What did he teach? And so for many of us, what Jesus said is really, really important, but he said a lot of things, right? He said a lot of different things, and sometimes it's hard to kind of narrow it down to one thing that he would be known for, but that's what we're going to look at today. And so as we kind of broke down this idea beginning last week, if you didn't get a chance to be here, I would encourage you to check out the message on our live stream page, where we kind of began this conversation that when Jesus showed up on the planet, the movement of Jesus was not a reiteration or a reintroduction of something old, but it actually was something entirely brand new. That what Jesus came to bring into your life into mine, into the followers of his in, his direct context when he was on the planet, was not an add-on, was not an extension of or an upgrade to, was actually something extremely brand new. And it was so challenging and even threatening at the time to the religious establishment that it got him killed for it. And it's because that no matter where you find yourself on the spiritual spectrum, this is true of you, it's true of me, is that we all still hold on to things that hold us back. There are things in your life, things in my life, that we hold on to out of comfort, out of just habit, that actually, if we were honest, they still hold us back. And when we hold on to things that hold us back, we sometimes can wonder why we're not making progress in our relationships or our finances or our spirituality. We ask these questions, and it's hard to look at things that we've gotten so used to with fresh eyes in a real light sometimes. And so when Jesus shows up on the planet, his kind of view of God, view of people, what he leads people towards, really brought brand new, fresh eyes to what we learned last week we're calling the temple model. And so just to give you a quick catch-up if you weren't here, the temple model reflects and describes almost every major world religion, even from thousands and thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt, the Babylonians, the Persians, and it is still very much alive and well today, and we even see it creeping into some of our modern Christian context pretty clearly. The temple model has 4 aspects to it. It was kind of created by Andy Stanley, who is a really, really great Southern preacher, so they all start with the same letter. But the temple model has sacred places. Right? There are places that you go that are more important to God than others. There are places that you go that you can access God better than other places. There are places that you go in the temple model that mean more, that you have to act a certain way or dress a certain way or say certain things or not say certain things in those sacred places. They also have sacred texts. There are certain writings or inscriptions or documents, books that become elevated in their value and that they in some way have the message of God contained within them, or the message of the gods contained within them. And so to help you and I, the common folk, understand these sacred texts, there are always people that are what religious people call a propitiator, right? There's something that goes in between. There are sacred men, and it's almost always men, that can translate and actually become gatekeepers of the messages in these sacred texts so that you and I can, one, know what God says and what God requires or demands or how to get in right with God or the gods, but also they become the ones who can hold our eternal destiny over our heads for us. And so those 3 components in the temple model always lead to the 4th, which is scared followers. It's not a typo. That one letter changing around really changes the meaning, right? Sacred places, sacred texts, sacred men, and then scared followers. Even if that feels like a heavy word, but there's always some space where religion actually tries to manipulate or control or lead us based on fear or superstition, or if you don't, you won't be okay with God. You can't really ever know where you stand in the temple model, because if you knew where you stood with God, you would no longer need those sacred men interpreting those sacred texts in those sacred places, and they would be out of a job. And so that's why they keep us that way. And we talked about how last week it is very easy for us, even in a really casual context like this, to see that even some of those aspects can be very similar and easy to miss in our pursuit of God. And we learned last week that if there is anyone that tells you or tells me that this is a thing that you have to do to earn your way to God or to earn approval from God, or if you don't do these things in a certain way, at a certain time, in a certain order, that God won't be pleased with you, that what that means is that that person does not understand Jesus, does not understand what God wants to communicate to us through Jesus. And so as we look to the scriptures today, we're not just looking to what many consider a sacred text, although the Bible in and of itself is an extraordinary library of writings spanning over thousands of years, that actually we're reading someone who knew Jesus that wrote down their experience. And what we do when we come to the scriptures is what we ought to do is say, what is happening there? What were they experiencing? And how does that translate into my life? And does that seem to fit my understanding of God? And if I've decided, which I have, and maybe you have, but maybe you haven't, if I've decided that this book actually means something to me, that I want to lead and direct my life in the direction of what it has to say based on these people who knew Jesus, then I can say, because of that, it's my choice to redirect my life in a way to match what they said Jesus said. Does that make sense? And so as we dive into it, I just want us to come to it with a proper understanding. And so if you have a copy of the Bible, you can turn to the book of Matthew. If not, there's a blue Bible in the seat back pocket directly in front of you. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at a very pivotal moment in Jesus' life where he was asked this question, what's the most important thing to God? And so turn to Matthew chapter 22. In the blue Bible, it's on page 483. And as we turn there, Matthew was a guy that, like I said, followed Jesus around for 3 years, watched what he did, watched what he said, but more importantly, experienced what it meant to be welcomed back into a group that he was excluded from by Jesus. That's the entire context that Matthew brings to anything he writes, is Matthew was a tax collector that had betrayed his own community, his own Jewish community, by collecting money for the Roman occupying empire. He had literally abandoned all of his friends and said, now I'm not your friend anymore, I'm working for the man, the big man, Caesar the man, right? And so when he experiences Jesus, his first experience with Jesus is someone saying, hey, you've counted yourself out, everybody else has counted you out, but I want to invite you in. So everything that Matthew experiences with Jesus comes from that lens, and when he writes down his life and his perspective on the teachings and the life that he experienced with Jesus, he brings that perspective to his account. And so we start in verse 34. Right? And so there's some context here that Jesus had been teaching, and people had asked him all different kinds of questions. What do you believe about marriage? What do you believe about paying taxes? What do you believe about the afterlife? We're not going to talk about any of that, although it's very, very fascinating. But eventually, the people that were trying to ask him all these questions to kind of get under his skin and try to find a way to disprove him, he had kind of silenced one important group because he had answered their questions appropriately, and they were confused, like, well, I guess that I don't know what to say with that. And so then the next group, like kind of the varsity team, came in, and it starts in verse 34 saying this: when the Pharisees had heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, these were two different sects of religious leaders, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, meaning Jesus, asked Jesus a question to test him and said, teacher, which of the law is great? Which is the great commandment in the law? Which is the great commandment in the law? And it's important that we read that accurately. Oftentimes we can think what they're saying is, what's the greatest commandment? Right? What's the most important thing? But what he's actually asking is a very traditional Jewish question of what is the one that supersedes and dominates everything else? Because in the Jewish tradition, they had 673 different laws that they had to memorize and keep in order to be good with God. That was their temple model. It wasn't just the Torah, the first 5 books of these scriptures. It wasn't just the 10 Commandments. It wasn't just the Talmud of all the extra things that Jewish teachers had said. There was 673 different things that they were meticulous to keep track of. But there was one that kind of dominated all of that kind of set the stage for all the other commands, and it was called the Shema. Everybody say Shema. Right, so it's not, my high school pastor said, it's not what you say to your mom when you're an angry teenager, Shema, right? So thank you, I'm glad one person thought that was funny. I did not think it was funny when I was a teenager, but that's okay, right? So the Shema, it literally is this breath word in Hebrew that is literally this idea of this is the thing that everything else hangs on. Right, this is the thing that everything else comes out of. If we live this command out, it's as easy as breathing that everything else comes away. And it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. So when he's asking Jesus this, he's not asking for his opinion. He's testing him. He's saying, can you pass? Because if you don't know the basics, we can't move forward. And so he asks him, what's the great commandment in the law? And he, meaning Jesus, said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. So Jesus not only answers the question accurately, but he places priority on it. He goes, I understand your system. You can trust that I communicate in a way and understand kind of where you're coming from, that what I'm about to say that you aren't expecting can actually fit in with this. And he goes on, and you've probably heard this, and he says, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. And when he says like it there, it doesn't mean, and it doesn't sound the same. He's not using a literary phrase. He's saying And a second is equal in value to God as loving the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind. Like equal to value to God as the Shema is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend, or a better word there in the Greek is hang. They find their weight. They are held up by all of the law and the prophets. So that's a really fun, Hebrew literary lesson right there, right? Where Jesus ultimately is creating this dichotomy that creates tension in his followers then, and I believe still to this day, tension in his followers' ears and minds and hearts, where he says, this thing that you've become so familiar with doesn't stand alone. This thing that you have so used to be able to say, and we have our own versions of it, of we love God and my religion is private or whatever it might look like, that is equated in God's mind. The vertical engagement we have with God is equated, according to Jesus, in God's mind with our horizontal relationships with one another. That those two things matter and are held equally. And beyond just that God sees them the same, that actually everything else in all of religion boils down to those two things. That if you just remember those two things, you actually can live out almost anything else, he would tell his first century Jewish audience. And I think for us today, if we look at those two things, love God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, that as simplistic as that feels, the challenge that Jesus extends to his listeners, that I believe he extends to you and to me today, is one that we often, if we're honest, want to back away from. We want to make it more complicated. We want to make it more confusing so that we don't have to engage and act on its behalf. See, when Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, that was where they believed your passion came from. As Katie taught us a moment ago, when we talk about worship, right, that you actually have a role to play, that Jesus taught his followers at one point, that if we won't worship God, even nature will scream out, but you're invited to engage with your Creator, with your loving Heavenly Father, with your heart, with your passion, with the thing that drives you, with the thing that makes you wake up in the morning. We should love God with our heart. It should motivate us. It shouldn't be stale. We should also love God with our soul, which to us in our modern context, the idea of soul is so ethereal, but for him, when he used that phrase, it's the truest part of who you are. That there's this deep, guttural intentionality around your connection with God. It's where your desire to know him more and to understand what you don't yet understand and to just be in his presence and to linger when life wants you to speed right through it and microwave your spirituality. No, I want to love God with my soul, with the essence of who I am. To step into the mystery that I can't possibly understand and know that God meets me there and I can bring all of my secrets and all of my shame and all of the things that everyone else, that Matthew would understand, that everyone else says, no, you can't come to God because of that. No, Jesus says, love God with your soul. God already sees it anyway, so bring your true self to him. And then to love God with all your mind, with your decision-making, with how you think. As the Apostle Paul would later write, that you should actually invite the Holy Spirit to transform the way you think about yourself, about your life, about your stuff, about the people you engage with. That if we love God with all of our mind, with how we schedule our time, how we spend our money, the decisions that we're going to make tomorrow morning at work, and how we parent, and all the ways that we cognitively think, do we love God? Do we bring God into the center of that? Or is God second or third or further back in line, or totally out of the question altogether, except when we're desperate and stuck and in need of some help? Do we love God with our mind? And then the second command that Jesus brings and ushers in, that he introduces, is to love your neighbor as yourself. He very clearly quantifies and qualifies how we are to love one another. That love to him is no longer just a feeling, that it is emotion that comes and goes, that's based on circumstances or how well we engage with one another, but that this was a life that we were invited to live that was represented no longer by religious duty or animal sacrifice, but of self-sacrifice, that you and I are invited to love our neighbor as yourself. And again, this entire discourse where Jesus says this has become known as the Great Commandment, as much as we might even let that title, the Great Commandment, right? We hold it in high regard. In this moment, when he spoke those words, and Matthew was like, ooh, that's good, I'm gonna write that down. This was so challenging because that was not what they were asking. They were not asking Jesus to introduce a new commandment. Actually, it was blasphemous and heresy to introduce a new commandment. Who are you, teacher? You can introduce, thoughts on the existing commandments. You can interpret a commandment, but you don't get to introduce a new commandment. That's not how this works, bro. That was their experience. And yet Matthew remembers that earlier when he was walking around, he recorded this in Matthew 5:17, that Jesus said, don't suppose for a minute that I've come to demolish the scriptures, to get rid of them, God's law or the prophets. I'm not here to demolish, but to complete. I'm going to put it all together. I'm going to help you see it for what it is. Another translation says actually all of what they would call, the Torah, the Hebrew scriptures, the law and the prophets, all of that was fulfilled in me, Jesus said. So Jesus was under no disillusion that what he taught. Matthew was under no disillusion that what he heard Jesus teach is that all of the Old Testament, all of the first 2/3 of this book that we can read and get even stuck on were signposts pointing to the fulfillment that came in the person of Jesus. That everything about God that they had been taught, that they had learned, was to draw their attention to a single person. And so Jesus knew that he could actually step in and say, so I'm going to make a new command. Because of that, I'm going to say the thing that matters most to God, actually how you love God, what all of the Old Testament that you're so familiar with, that you're so aware of, that you even have reverence for or disdain for, all of that finds its weight, finds its validation in this phrase, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we could go, that's really interesting. Cool. Thanks for church today. Right? That could stay in a cognitive thought process. But I want us to drill a little bit deeper in the next few moments to ask the question, what does that really look like for you and for me? Like this afternoon with your spouse, tomorrow with your coworker, later this week with your neighbor. Like, what does that idea that how we love God, vertically actually, is demonstrated by how we love each other horizontally, that there is a space where I am to love you the way I love myself. What does that actually look like? And for many of us, we can get stuck on this idea, this question of what does God want? Like, what is the thing I'm supposed to do? Right? We have our thinking so locked into, and our consciousness are so influenced by this temple model thinking that we so often can look for a list of do's and don'ts, of right and wrongs, of ins and outs, of engage with or don't touch that, right, kind of thing. And we can often ask the question, well, what should I do? What does God want from me? And what I love about Jesus is he simplifies it so much. He says, actually, you no longer have to have someone interpret this for you. You no longer have to go to a sacred place to open up a sacred book to really understand this. It's actually already written on your soul because you, as we learned last week, are made in the image of God, and you yourself are sacred, and you actually already know what to do. You actually already know what to do because you can always know what to do in any situation with any person to fulfill the greatest commandment that Jesus gave you. You can already know what to do. You can always know what to do when you ask, what does love require of you? What does love require of you? And I guarantee you, in that moment, you'll know the answer. Man, my boss is driving me crazy, and I want to ditch out early. What would love require of you? I don't know. I don't know what to do with this relationship that's just torn up, and it just feels like it's too far gone, and we can't there might not be hope. What should I do? Counselor, what should I do? Pastor, what should I do? Well, what would love require of you? When your kid's driving you crazy, whether they're 4, 14, or 44, right? You can always know what to do. by asking the question, what would love require of you? And like, that's cool, it's cute and rhymes, and I'll try to remember that. But to actually put legs to that and to have it roll out in your everyday, ordinary life becomes this transformative principle. That if I simply ask the question, what would love require of me in this moment? What would love look like? If I were to actually do that, I would fulfill the first and great commandment and the second that Jesus introduced. That I would actually be able to love God and love other people by simply asking that one question and trusting that the Spirit of God, regardless of my religious affiliation, would rush in and interrupt that moment to help me understand what to do and then give me the choice to follow through or not. That is actually this brand new way of Jesus where he says, this is how I want you to engage. That it's no longer a list of do's and don'ts, whether it's 10, 673 or whatever number you want to pick. It's actually simply a question that you ask to engage with God in a new way. What would love require of me, of you, in this moment, in this context? See, one of the things I love about Jesus is he gave far more questions to ask than answers to memorize. And I love to memorize things. I'm actually pretty good at it. Some of us are not. I happen to be married to someone who's not. And so luckily for you, if you hate memorizing things, you can simply memorize one question to ask. And then in any context, you can simply ask this question: what would love require of me? And you know that you know the right answer to that question when you don't want to do it. You're like, oh, that can't be right. Let me ask again. It's like those fun filters where you're like, oh, I don't like the answer. Just swipe left and do it again, right? It's like, what Disney character are you? Random question. I never ever ever. No. What is love? Like, we should make one. That'd be awesome. Any programmers in the house, let me know. We can make a filter. We'll see if it goes anywhere, right? What would love require of you? Tell me your situation. You shake the magic 8-ball if you remember the 90s. What would love require of me? And you'll get an answer, and most likely you might go, but there's something else I should do, right? Maybe I'll just pray about it. You don't have to pray about it even, Jesus would say. That if you ask that question, what would love require me to do when I've screwed up? What would love require me to do in my marriage? What would love require me to do at my job? What would love require me to do with my perceived enemy? What would love require of you? The Apostle Paul later would write to a small church in the suburbs of Rome, and he would communicate this same idea to them. They were in a context where they were very, very excited about this freedom that Jesus offered, because they were in the middle of a very oppressed part of the empire where they were pushed down and persecuted. And so they really held on to this idea of freedom. And Paul writes them and says, you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, but do not use your freedom as an opportunity for your flesh. Or don't just do what you want to do. But through, here it is again, love, serve one another. Serve one another. Not because you memorized the list, not because some sacred person told you to, not because it's in the Bible. Out of love, serve one another. And then he repeats this same idea that Jesus said, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Another translation says, the only thing that counts is your faith demonstrating itself through love. And again, this is the Apostle Paul, a extremely well-versed Pharisee previous to Jesus. He would have been in the crew that asked Jesus this troubling question back in Matthew 22. He would have been the type of person that was very proud of his religious experience and religious notoriety and religious elitism. Maybe you know some of those people, right? I used to be one of those kinds of people, right? Like, this is who Paul was. And for him, of all people, to say, actually, all those things that I spent time and energy doing, those years of school that I went through, really the only thing that matters is your faith expressing itself through love. That all those things that I thought used to make me special, all those things that I thought used to make me valuable, that used to help me be closer to God than you so I could look down my nose at you, it's actually all for naught. It's not a waste, like it's still helpful, but really the only thing that counts, all of that can be summed up simply in you shall love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. And so it's interesting because, in my job, people ask all the time, what does your church believe? What do you believe? Like give me your 10-page doctrinal statement. And I'm like, I just haven't written that many pages on doctrine. And really, it's on our website. You can check it out. Like our doctrinal beliefs here are really very simple. We believe that Jesus is who he said he was. He's going to do what he said he's going to do, and that we should do what he says we should do. Like it really is that simple. And people ask all the time, well, why don't you you talk about love a lot. I'm like, okay, sounds like a complaint. Go on. Talk about love a lot. Like, where's the anger and the wrath of God and all? And I go, yeah, that is in this book. But the context for that is always leading up to the person of Jesus. So we should talk about that. We should feel bad when we leave church. That's how I know I'm close to God. I'm like, oh man, that's so much temple model thinking. The reason we don't talk about the wrath of God that much is because all we have to talk about is Jesus, because he took care of it. The reason we don't talk about all these things that you have to do is because there's this sense that we trust that if you simply come to Jesus and listen to what he says and try as best you know how to engage with him and to do what he says you should do, we don't have to keep score and keep the law anymore. That love has replaced law-keeping in the family of Jesus, in the people of Jesus. And not just I feel loving. No, verb love, tangible, expressed, actionable. Your faith working itself out in love is the only thing that counts. And so, to sum it all up, for those of us that call ourselves followers of Jesus, for those of you who, like me, in all the ways that we struggle, are trying to live our life in a way that best reflects Jesus as best we know how, with all of our sin and all of our questions and all of our doubts and limitations, I want to leave us with this challenge that I hope will come to your mind later this week when you are in a moment of conflict and you've asked this question, what does love require of me? And you've felt the answer and you've felt your resistance to do what you know the answer is. I heard this phrase a couple weeks ago, and it was just so challenging and so good, I wanted to share it with you. It says, Jesus didn't die so that we could treat others the way we treated him. That Jesus didn't give his life to forgive you, to restore you, to invite you home so that we could treat others the way we treated him. So that we could treat other people with judgment. So that we could treat other people with holding them accountable when we don't want to be held accountable ourselves. We don't want to have the same conversations around, what did Jesus deserve? But I love to have the conversation, what do I deserve? What do I think I deserve? Or better, man, what did they deserve? They hurt me. They don't think the same way I think. They don't vote for the same person I'm going to vote for. What did they deserve? I mean, we love that conversation. But Jesus didn't give his life so that you and I could treat other people the way we treated him, as expendable, as unnecessary, as a criminal. So who in your life are you holding hostage? Like right now, like in your brain, in your heart. My guess is that there's someone that if you're really honest, if you really want to engage with this conversation, that you have held at a distance or held in bondage. They don't know it, but you know it. And their name comes up, or you see a post on Facebook and you feel it rise up in you. Jesus didn't die so that I could treat them the way we treated him. Jesus didn't die so that you could treat them the way we treated him. Jesus didn't die so that you could treat yourself the way we treated Jesus. Because for many of us, that's our tension. Is I got to beat myself up for the things I know I've done wrong. I got to hold myself to pay for the things that I didn't do right. I got to, Jesus says, actually, you know what? It's actually all about receiving and surrendering to the reality that God has already demonstrated his love towards you, that while you and I were still stuck in our mess, while we were still sinners, Christ gave his life for you. Like, that's actually the whole game. That's the whole thing. And as simplistic and as diet and as threatening to sound like watered down as that might be, try it. It's not diet. It's not watered down. It's actually the most challenging invitation there is. And yet it's the thing that we have received from God. It's the thing that you have received from God. That the whole story is wrapped up and fulfilled. That we should love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So I love God with my heart, my soul, and my mind, my decisions, my passion, my true self. And I love other people in their true self in the same way. And when we do that, in the small ways that shows up, or in the transformative lifestyle trajectory shifts that happen over time as we begin to ask ourselves the question, what does love require of me in this moment? As we do that, friends, that is how we change the world. It's how you change your marriage, change your kids, change your neighborhood, change your workplace, by simply asking one question. And you always know what to do when you ask, what does love require of you? So my challenge for you this week is, when you don't want to ask it, ask that question. When you don't want to do it, because you're going to know the answer, what does love require of you? What does love require of you? How can I sacrifice and step into the posture of Jesus with this person? And when you do, I promise you, God will meet you. That's the brand new that Jesus wanted to bring. And it was brand new then, and it still is brand new today, because it will surprise your boss, surprise your spouse, and surprise your enemy. When you ask, what would love require of me? And then do it.